basic strategies of plants and how they have survived on this planet for as long as they have. I thought I would start with this picture here of my vertebrate standing behind a plant in our backyard. What do you see? Do you see a big leaf? Or do you see something blocking the door? Or how about this? Maybe you see a massive solar energy panel that takes energy from space to make a biologically useful form of energy. I'm sure that you chose C, and you would be right, because in fact plants are pretty amazing. They're able to take sunlight energy from outer space and convert it into usable chemical energy. Before plants, keep in mind that for 3 billion years, there really was no life on land. And 500 million years ago, plants began to colonize land. And now, today, we have over 290,000 living species of plants. That's a whole lot of plants. Now, certainly there are more animals than that, but still, as a group, plants are quite diverse. So, what is a plant? Well, we know that in general, plants are multicellular. That is, they are organisms made up of more than one cell. They generally all do photosynthesis, with only a few exceptions. They all develop from an embryo, and the vast majority of plants are terrestrial. That is, they live on land or at least have or some association with land, even if they are aquatic. Now, plants evolved from algal protists initially, and I'm showing you a picture of one. These are called caryophytes, and caryophytes are the closest modern relative to the ancestor that gave rise to plants. These caryophytes are still present today, and by the way, this linkage here, of modern day caryophytes to being closely related to the ancestors that ultimately gave rise to plants, is confirmed by DNA evidence. And this was kind of followed up by a transition over evolutionary time towards living on land. So caryophytes are aquatic plants, or I should say aquatic algae. And the transition to land really was an interesting one. It was very difficult in some ways because it created some huge challenges to plants that were evolving to live on land. But it also provided some really interesting benefits as well. So we're going to cover both. So the question is, what features of land living would benefit plants? Well, let's go over the benefits. Here's the benefits to living on land. First of all, there's more sunlight. It's not filtered by the water. This means that you have much more efficient photosynthesis. There's also more CO2 in the air than there is CO2 dissolved in water. More of the minerals and nutrients that you need to grow are concentrated in soils far more than they are in water. In water, they happen to be much more diffuse. And also, when you are evolving to live up on land, there are far fewer herbivores or pathogens, at least initially when you first start evolving up there. Clearly, over time, as animals also began to continue moving up onto land, they kind of changed all of that. But these were at least the initial benefits to living up on the land. Well, what about the challenges? What challenges might you face? Well, number one is water supply. As we covered both in the uh, metabolism lecture and respiration, and also in the photosynthesis lecture, you absolutely need water. You can't be without it. In fact, it drives photosynthesis and it provides the medium, that is, it provides the solution within which gametes and spores will disperse and spread themselves around. Well, the other problem is that air is a lot less dense than water, and therefore you have to have more structural material just to hold yourself up. In water, it's less of an issue. And it is pretty well established now that modern plants all evolved from these caryophyte ancestors, or ancestors related to caryophytes, and that caryophytes ultimately arose from chlorophytes. And chlorophytes are green algae. You can still see green algae if you go out to into the tide pools around Orange County. Um, they happen to grow on the rocks right where the ocean kind of meets the land. And I threw this one up here as well, the red algae. Red algae is a distant relative to the green algae. Green algae gives rise to caryophytes, which are within the lineage that is the direct descendants to modern day plants. So the evolution of plants is quite interesting. major changes occur when now that plants are up on land, and those major changes are occurring in transport and reproductive strategies, and each one conveys some sort of an advantage, and we're going to explore these now. There are derived traits of being a plant. In fact, these are the 4 derived traits. These are keys that are found in plants but are in fact absent in the caryophytes. Number 1, alternation of generation. That is, they produce this multicellular organism that you recognize as an adult plant, but their larvae, that is, their gametes, in this case equivalent to your sperm and eggs, are also multicellular, which is really weird. We're going to explore that in just a second here. You have walled spores, which are tough, and they are produced in a sporangia. So this is another defining characteristic of plants. And again, multicellular gametangia. The gametes are multicellular as part of this alternation of generation. The last derived trait of plants here is that they possess what's called an apical meristem. And in this case, the apical meristem is that part of the plant which would be most equivalent to like stem cells. They would be equivalent to the stem cells of plants. These cells end up differentiating into all the different tissues of the plant. Now, these ones here we're going to de-emphasize until later. We're going to really focus on this alternation of generation phase for the next 6 or 7 slides. But we need to first start with the plant life cycle. All plants do sex. They all perform sexual reproduction, and you know that to be true when you see plants with flowers, which we're going to get to at the end of this lecture. But even plants that don't have flowers are engaging in sex too. Plant life cycles include a very weird multicellular haploid phase, and this is very different from animals. In animals, we actually have a haploid phase, which is short-lived. It's your sperm and your eggs, right? The eggs are sitting there in a one-end state in your body if you're female, and males are producing a whole bunch of sperm on a daily basis, and these sperm are also haploid in phase. And in our case, the diploid phase, the adult phase, is created when you take a sperm and an egg and you put them together to form a fertilized egg. What happens to that fertilized egg? Well, it divides and divides and divides until it grows up to be a little baby, and that baby eventually grows up to be an adult. That entire phase, from the fertilized egg all the way through to the adult, is a diploid organism. That is, you contain 2 copies of your DNA, right? And we often think of the sperm and the egg as just another, it's basically our way of reproducing ourselves. In plants, their equivalent of sperm and eggs, their gametes, are multicellular. Yes, that is bizarre. I know, it sounds weird, but their equivalent of sperm and eggs divide up until they form little organisms, little plants that are still haploid. They're still haploid. They're like the sperm and the eggs, but they're multicellular. And these in turn get together to conduct to complete sexual reproduction. So here's a sperm, here's an egg. You kind of understand that. And yet in plants, here is that gametophyte stage. Gametophytes are multicellular haploid phases. That's right, there is more than one cell in this gametophyte that you're looking at here from a fern. And it is the equivalent of a sperm or an egg. It's just multicellular. So these produce gametes, and they produce sperm and ova by mitosis rather than meiosis because they are already haploid. Since they already have half the complement of DNA, they don't need to continue to go through another meiosis phase. They just go through regular old cell division, mitosis, going from being 1N to being 1N again, just like that. Now, the adult phase, quote unquote, of the plant, that being equivalent to like you and me, is the sporophyte. This is also multicellular, just like you and I are. They are the diploid 2N phase. These guys are the ones that produce the spores through meiosis. Okay. Now, the spores are a reproductive cell that develops into a multicellular gametophyte. And this occurs without fertilization. This is another bizarre twist that plants do that you and I don't, is that they actually produce these gametophytes without actually undergoing fertilization initially. So this alternation of generation phase is actually very interesting. It's totally different from what animals do. Here you have the sporophyte again. This is the 2N phase, the one that would be equivalent to you and me. You have meiosis occurring at some point within this plant, producing these spores, which are only 1N now. These spores, which are the equivalent of your sperm and eggs, then undergo mitosis, creating these 1N gametophytes. These are multicellular, but in each of these cells, there's still only one copy of the DNA. They continue to undergo mitosis, producing more gametes here, and these gametes are the ones that then carry out fertilization, turning back into a 2N organism, a true zygote, which then grows up to be the adult plant again. I know, that's kind of strange, isn't it? It doesn't happen in humans. I mean, think about this. If this happened in humans, essentially, you would be making sperm and eggs. You drop those sperm and eggs on the ground, and the sperm and eggs would start undergoing mitosis. Remember, there's still 1N as it is. So they make multicellular little mini-me's out of you that are now able to walk around as multicellular sperm and eggs. And then they spit off these little gametes, which then get together and form and do the sexual reproduction. I know that's kind of strange, and yet that is how plants work. So here is the breakdown of all plants. The first division here of plants are those that are non-vascular. That is, plants that don't have vascularization for delivering water up and down it or nutrients throughout the rest of the plant. And these include the mosses. We're going to cover them in a number of slides. And then there are the vascular plants, and that is mostly the plants that you're familiar with. We're going to start first with the plants that don't produce seeds necessarily, and those would be like the ferns. The ferns are a classic case of that. Then we're going to go into the seed-bearing plants, which include two different divisions, the non-flowering plants and then the flowering plants. The non-flowering plants include conifers, which include pine trees, for example, which produce lots and lots of pollen, but they don't produce flowers. And then finally, the flowering plants, the Anthophyta. And these guys are really amazing because they have taken plant evolution to an extreme, producing this flower which does all of that sexual reproduction kind of for the organism. Kind of neat. Now, the earliest plants, again, the division Bryophyta, include the mosses. These guys are extremely small. And they also absorb fluids and liquids, water mostly, through their tissues. And finally, their haploid phase is the one that is dominant. This is totally bizarre. Again, you think of yourself as dominant and your sperm and eggs as being just this small subset of you. Well, in the mosses, in the bryophytes, it's the exact opposite. The haploid phase, that phase which is equivalent to your sperm and eggs, is actually the dominant phase. This picture here, all that green that you're looking at, that's all haploid. And only those little spores, those little brown spores that are sticking up, those are the the diploid phase of this organism. Now, these guys need lots and lots of water. You will not find mosses living in the desert generally. Unless there happens to be a place in the desert where there's lots of water, because they require this water for reproduction and for survival. And their reproduction is incredibly complex, so we're going to summarize it just in general. But again, I want to point something out to you as far as the anatomy of this organism. Here's another moss, and these mosses, again, most of this structure that you're looking at is gametophyte. It's 1N. And the sporophyte, the 2N phase here, is just this little sprig sticking up right here. And it is inside here where the sporangium is. And this is the 2N phase. This is the only part of that. Again, it's totally backwards from what you would expect, and certainly what you see in animals. Now, they reproduce using sperm which swim to an egg. All right, that's familiar, right? That seems kind of normal. And the sperm swim to the egg in the female gametophyte. Well, how are you going to swim to the egg? Well, you can only achieve that if you are swimming in water. This is why they require water. The life cycle of this organism is quite complex. I swim. Yes, there you go. Um, Again, down here, this green part here is the 1N phase, the gametophyte phase, and they also have separate sexes. They have male and female gametophytes. At the very top here is this sporangium. This is the 2N area of the plant, and it is here that they undergo meiosis. Undergo meiosis, creating a 1N spore. And these 1N spores then go on to develop. Here you have a male that's developing. Over here is a female that's developing. Again, the equivalent of like a female's egg falling out of her uterus and then dividing and dividing and dividing until it forms a multicellular 1N organism. Up here, it's like a sperm falling out of your body, becoming a multicellular sperm up here. And then these things mature, and in either raindrops or in water droplets that are on the ground, these sperm then become mobile, and they swim to find what's called the archegonium of this female gametophyte over here. And this is where fertilization takes place. Now the organism is, or the fertilized organism is down here in this archegonium. This is the only place where you see the 2N organism in this phase, and all of the green around it, the stuff that will end up being this, is still 1N. This 2N phase here then builds a little straw-like structure which sticks up to eventually create the sporangium again. So this is the organism. Again, the part that is emphasized in the mosses, in the bryophytes, is this 1N gametophyte. The 2N sporophyte is the one that is de-emphasized. Now, we're going to draw a distinction here between the bryophytes, which are kind of off on this branch of the plant tree, and all the organisms that then proceed on from here, those that are vascular. Vascular plants evolved about 420 million years ago, so they have been around for a fairly long period of time. And vascular plants, so here's non-vascular plants over here, and here are the vascular plants. So this is the division that we're looking at now. We're going up to the line that goes to the vascular plants. And the nuance here in the vascular plants is that these guys have evolved a transportation system, a system for moving water from soils all the way up to the leaves, and also for moving the sugars and other good stuff here from the leaves down to the rest of the plant. So they have this two-way traveling system here, and so vascular plants have created these pipe-like tubes that allow for the conduction of water and nutrients up and down in the plant. And by doing this, you actually can permit the growth of huge plants. These redwoods here are extremely tall, and in fact, sequoia trees, among the largest trees in the world, are drawing water from the forest floor here and bringing them up this plant, this tree, all the way to the tip tops of the trees, the canopies. These are incredibly large distances, but by having this system of vascularization, it can allow for huge size. So by having a vascular system, we are not confined the way that bryophytes are, which have to be very low to the ground and very small. Now, we have a name for these tubes. We call one of them xylem. Xylem is the tube that is lined with dead cells in this plant, and it is what transports water and minerals from the roots up to the leaves. In contrast to that, phloem, which is made up of living cells, is able to transport sugars from the leaves down through the rest of the plant. Now, the vascular plants, oh, I forgot to mention, yeah, here's going up, and there's going down. and they're color-coded for you, which is kind of nice. But now let's go over the life cycle of the next group of plants, the pterophytes. The pterophytes are made up mostly of ferns, and we're going to see that in just a second here. But let's go over the fern life cycle here. In this case, the sporophyte is still kind of de-emphasized, but not as much as in the bryophytes. So here you have the sporophyte, which is on the underside of the leaves of ferns. So if you've ever seen a fern when you're walking down the street or maybe in your front yard, what you were mostly looking at down here is the adult plant producing the 2N organism here. And inside these sporangiums here is where meiosis takes place, and you're producing spores. And these spores then, which are now 1N because you've undergone meiosis, the spores here then undergo this alternation of generation again, where they become multicellular gametophytes. So again, this is like a multicellular sperm or a multicellular egg. And on these little plates here, on the front of these mature gametophytes, is where the male and female parts are going to be generated. So in the antheridium, we're still using the same terminology as we did in the bryophytes. In the antheridium is where that motile sperm is being created. And then up here in the archegonium is where the eggs are maturing. And the life cycle is completed when the sperm swims into the archegonium here, fertilizes an egg, and voila, you're back to being 2N again. And so this is the interesting part, is that while in the bryophytes, the sporophyte portion was de-emphasized, that is, the 2N portion was de-emphasized, in the ferns, it's more 50-50, where half of the life cycle is dominated by being 2N, and the other half is dominated by being 1N. So here's the pterophytes again. Ptero as in pterodactyl, right? P-T-E-R-O actually means wing, and phyte means plant. So these are almost like winged plants. Well, it kind of looks like a wing, don't you think? Okay, so this is the sporophyte of a fern right here that you are looking at. And this is where the 1N wind dispersal is taking place. So all those spores are then wafting off, and they eventually land in or near water or in soil that is very moist. And these 1N spores then begin to undergo mitosis, developing into a multicellular gametophyte. Again, gametophytes are still 1N. And they look kind of heart-like, which is kind of neat. But these guys still require water for reproduction because the sperm must still enter the archegonium by swimming. And it's very interesting. If you don't have a lot of water around, ferns will not grow very well. You need water. And so you're looking at a forest floor here up in the Pacific Northwest where there's lots and lots of ferns around. And now what does this mean? Well, it means that it actually limits the distribution of ferns to only wet habitats. Now, the next evolutionary trend in the plants, now we're done kind of with the seedless vascular plants, the pterophytes, is the development of seeds. And this is where we're going now, seed-bearing plants. And reproductive challenges with living in dry habitats are immense. For example, let's say you're now going to move away from the water, because remember, bryophytes and pterophytes both require water. Bryophytes and pterophytes have motile sperm, and that motile sperm must be able to swim into those archegonium by having water. Well, if you are a plant and you're evolving the ability to live in real dry habitats, you need to overcome this limitation of requiring water. You need to be able to reproduce without water. And you also have to be able to avoid the drying out of your offspring, or desiccation. You also have to deal with this issue of dispersal. Remember, these other kinds of plants that we already talked about require water for dispersal. So how are you going to overcome that? The answer is seeds. Seeds actually solve this problem in many, many ways. there are advantages to being a seed-producing vascular plant. Seeds totally changed the course of evolution for plants because, number one, they offered protection to the developing embryo from the environment. And also, seeds provide a little packet of food. They feed the embryo, which is actually the nutritious part of the seed that you get when you eat a seed. So the transition from going from seedless to seeded is a huge evolutionary trend within the plants. Seeds really are just an embryo covered by a protective coat. They do not require water for fertilization. Fertilization actually ends up being internalized, and it prevents the drying out and some protection from predators. And also, let's not forget, providing a little nutrient meal for the developing embryos themselves. So this is how we kind of view this evolutionary trend. Here we have our non-vascular plants first. Next we have our vascular plants kind of branching off from that. Within the vascular plants we have those that don't produce seeds and then those that do. So now we're heading up this line here towards those seed-producing vascular plants. And the earliest division here are the conifers, or Coniferophyta, and you know these things to be pine trees. It's actually pine trees and their relatives. Pine trees are vascular plants. See, you can tell because they're extremely tall, and they do produce seeds. And in this case, the pollen is the male gametophyte. That stuff that makes you sneeze when you're standing around a pine tree when it's giving off all of those tons and tons of pollen, yeah, that's actually sperm. It's actually the equivalent of sperm wafting through the airs. So next time you're sneezing next to a pine tree, think about that. The cones are actually the site of the spore and the gametophyte production. So there are male and female cones, and they look like this. You've probably seen these before, but you may not have recognized them. If you see a big cone like that, well, that's the female part. And then on other trees, because they have separate sexes, there are male and female pine trees. Over here, these little chalky looking things, which are kind of soft, these are the male cones. These are the ones that are producing the pollen. And what's really interesting about the pollen is that it actually has wings. Pine tree pollen, that is the male gametophyte, is winged. And the reason it's winged is because these guys are all airborne. That is, wind blows, these things need to stay aloft for a long period of time so that they can make it from one tree to the next. They need to go and find a female tree. And, this is actually a pretty neat thing. Tons and tons of sperm, essentially, or pollen, is blown across a pine forest, and this is how female trees are effectively inseminated. Now, this is pretty darn successful, but wind pollination is, in fact, somewhat wasteful too, right? I mean, not every one of those pollen grains is going to get to make it to a target, right? Only a very small select few. So in the grand scheme of things, yeah, this is a pretty neat strategy. It takes care of that whole issue of needing water, and it takes care of the issue of dispersal. It uses the air. But you get poor survival of the individual pollen grains, selecting for only a few individuals that are just randomly chosen because they just happen to be the ones that the wind successfully transports from the male tree to the female tree. Kind of like this. There you go. That was my animation for the day. But, wouldn't it be nice if we could take some of those pollen grains and very selectively deliver them properly to the female plants? Well, that would be nice, right? We wouldn't have to waste so much pollen. We wouldn't have to pour so much resources, so much of our energy into producing tons of pollen that will never make it. Well, that's true. Here's a plant. There is a way to do it, isn't there? What if the pollen could be delivered directly? You know this to be true, right? There you go. Bees. That's right. There is another development which arises shortly after the development of pollen, and that is the production of flowers. Flowers are reproductive structures for the specific distribution of pollen. by either animal or by the wind, but usually by an animal, most often an insect, but it could be other things. And you don't require tons of pollen to be blown everywhere with only a little bit of it making it. Here, you can actually very targetedly take some pollen and deliver it to another flower. And this is the next division that we need to consider here. Let's not forget we have our non-vasculars here, our vascular plants here. Here is where our division of having seeds is, right? Pterophytes don't produce seeds, but everything else does. And within those that produce seeds, we also have to make a distinction here between the angiosperms and those other gymnosperms. Gymnosperms include conifers. These guys here, the angiosperms, are producing flowers. So this is what distinguishes flower producers from the gymnosperms like the conifers. Isn't that neat? So Anthophyta, the angiosperms. These are the flowering plants. And flowering plants, again, just going through all of those same connections here, they are vascular, they do produce seeds, but you know what? Producing a flower like this was a huge, huge evolutionary leap. These guys are the most diverse group of plants on the planet by far. They outnumber all other plant species on the planet. And they use animals and sometimes wind, but usually animals for dispersal. And the flowers end up dispersing the pollen. And what you end up with in the center of the flower here, underneath all of this, is the ovarium, which eventually swells to produce a fruit. We're going to talk about fruits in a little bit. But I just think it's really interesting. Flowers are amazing things, aren't they? Flowers are essentially a way to increase the fertilization success in plants, which is why they are the most speciose group, right? Well, we know that flowers also increase the reproductive success of humans too, especially when you give it to your boyfriend or girlfriend. Yeah, but Bob. Now, in some flowers, this has been taken to an extreme. It's not just that they invite a bee or a wasp or a fly to enjoy a little nectar meal. In some cases, some flowers have actually tapped into the evolutionary buttons of certain insects to get them turned on. Take a look at this orchid flower right over here. This orchid, look at the face. The face looks very much like the wasp that is doing its thing over here. This wasp is not just getting a meal. This flower actually looks like a female wasp. Not only does it look like a female wasp, it smells like a female wasp. So this wasp over here isn't just eating a little meal, he's actually getting it on with this flower because the smell and the look are basically signaling him to reproduce with this flower. Now, obviously, this flower isn't being inseminated by the wasp, but the action of him kind of going at it on this flower is allowing this flower to spread its pollen all over the top of him. He's then going to go on to another orchid, do the same thing, and in the process, fertilize that orchid. I don't know. I kind of think of that as a pretty extreme case. That's pretty extreme. Now, what about the production of fruits? You know, it's not just that you want to invite a little insect over to pollinate you. Once you have produced a viable seed, you now need somebody to kind of spread that seed around. And that's where fruits come in. Fruits really are the mature, swollen ovary of a flower. That's right. When you are eating a fruit, you're eating the mature, swollen ovary of a flower. The flower petals drop off. The ovary, which is very small and in the center of a flower initially, begins to swell, stores a lot of starches, a lot of sugars, a lot of other nutrient goodness, and this is essentially high-tech bribery to entice other organisms like this bat over here or even this little monkey to eat them and ingest the entire fruit, and the animals end up eating the seeds too. Hopefully they don't chew it onto the seeds, or at least not onto all of them. And they end up pooping out the seeds. And here's what's really cool is that anytime an organism poops out the seeds, what are they also doing? Well, they're dropping a whole lot of fertilizer right where the seeds need it. Well, that's kind of convenient, isn't it? That's very convenient. Now, um, and that's true of you too. If it weren't for the fact that you poop in a toilet, if you were just pooping outside, then perhaps if you swallowed a couple of seeds from, let's say, these grapes or these strawberries or this kiwi that you may have eaten, well, then you're going to be spreading those around too with a nice little nutrient fertilizer packet too. Other fruits, now, fruiting bodies don't necessarily have to look like an apple or an orange. They can look like this, these sort of things here. These are fruits too. The coconuts on a coconut tree, well, that's also fruit, right? But the little burrs that stick into your socks when you're walking by grasses, those are also considered fruits. Why? Because these are the swollen ovaries of a flower. Okay, well, if that's a fruit, then what's a vegetable? A vegetable is every other part of the plant that is not the swollen ovary of a flower. So celery sticks, those are like stalks. Carrots, those are the roots. Um, Onions, those are the bulbs of a plant. Those are all vegetables. But things like cucumbers, peppers, oranges, strawberries, these are all the swollen ovaries of flowers and therefore are considered fruits in a biological context. Now, we've just now gone through all the major divisions within the plants, and I want to have one final summary slide here. Oh yeah, here's another fruiting body. Um, this here is a really nice synopsis of this alternation of generation within plants. Over here, we start off with non-plants that are green alga. Green alga here are all one N. They are all gametophyte, essentially. Bryophytes, the first true plants that we talked about, the vast majority of the plant here is gametophyte. It's one N. Only this part up here, this little sporangium here, this is the only 2N part of the bryophyte. Then we went to the ferns. Ferns are about 50-50. They are represented by gametophyte and sporophyte examples within the life cycle of this organism. And then we graduate from there to the gymnosperms. The gymnosperms included the conifers, the coniferophytes, where the majority of the adult plant here is dominated by this sporophyte phase. This, when you're looking at a tree, you're looking at the sporophyte. And it really is the pollen grains and what is at the base of each of those cones that is the 1N phase here. Okay? Then we get to the angiosperms, and that is taken to an even further extreme, where you have the tree is essentially 2N, and only these little spores here are 1N. This is the evolutionary trend that we witness in trees. Make sure that you understand the major divisions within the trees and each of those evolutionary trends that occurs within each of those divisions. And I will see you in cyberspace.